Hi, we're about to start our webinar looking at fraud activity, the increase in incidents and what can be done to mitigate attacks, and with the headlines from the latest research that IFOL's completed with SAP Concur. People are joining us now and we'll start in a few moments. Meantime, if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat, we can see where you are now. And that's just before we get started. We'll be going quite soon. So welcome to today's webinar, and we're asking, are fraudsters targeting your AP department? Chances are someone is, internally, externally. Incidents are increasing, and we've got the latest figures from our research and the experts, fortunately, to help us explore the ways to identify and mitigate risks and make your AP department more secure. We'll provide you with a guide following the session, and there's no need to make any notes. If you have any questions as we go along, please put them in the chat and we'll do our best to pick them up, respond to them. I'm Sue Beardsmore. Today I'm joined by our experts. Deborah Richardson. Hi, Deborah. Deborah is an accounts payable consultant and trainer with over 20 years experience in AP, AR, general ledger and financial reporting for Fortune 500 companies. For over 10 years, she focused on global vendor maintenance and implemented a vendor self-registration portal for over 140,000 global vendors. She's expert in authentication techniques, internal controls, and best practices to prevent fraud in the vendor master file. So clearly a good woman to have on the team, as is Sarah Hurst, a Senior Director of Client Sales at SAP Concur, which is a cloud-based system which connects expense, travel, and vendor invoice spend. Sarah, welcome to you. So tell us a little more about yourself and also SAP Concur, please.
Sure. Yeah. So I do support our client base here in Canada, and we talk to our clients a lot about cost control, improving visibility, and spend through process automation, which in turn is going to help identify fraud, hopefully before it happens, as well as compliance checks after the fact.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. So let's kick off with the very basic kind of question, how and why fraud actually occurs. Deborah, in your huge experience, what would you like to kick off with there?
Yeah, and so I'd just like to start with like the simplest answer that is out there. It's because they can, right? Both internal and external frauds. So with internal frauds, right, employees know where the gaps are, and with external fraud, it's actually easier now for a fraudster to be successful. For example, with business email compromise, where they're changing vendor bank details or remittance addresses for diverting check payments, because that's still happening. Because, you know, after all of these infrastructure breaches that we've seen and ransomware over the past couple of years, IT teams have really been focused on, right, shoring up those issues so that they can occur, really just kind of ignoring the social engineering that goes into these fraudulent emails and scams. And so it's actually easier for the fraudsters now to, you know, send out multiple mass emails and get that one or two that's going to result in fraudulent payments, right? And so they've really been focusing on that since, right, almost 3 years now. The accounts payable team has been busy, distracted, right, working in multiple types of environments. So it's just because they can, right? And AP, unfortunately, is the target of many of those scams.
So although we think we're getting more sophisticated in all sorts of ways, so are the fraudsters, and you're saying it's absolutely easier now. Sarah, do you agree with that? Do you see that's what's going on?
Absolutely. I mean, the internal fraud, there's lots of unintentional fraud, simply not knowing what the policy is, or having the ability to check back and forth while they're traveling or doing other things, you know, and having that book beside them to see what's within and what's outside of policy. So I think it's the gaps that are creating the space for people to be able to create fraud or do fraud on an organization unintentionally.
Yeah.
Deborah.
Sorry, I just wanted to add one more thing. And we talked about the fraudsters innovating. They absolutely are. I reported a new scam alert last year where the fraudsters were advertising on the dark web for a native English speaker, right? So that they can shore up all those grammatical mistakes and the context, get the context right. So yes, they are innovating.
And it's a sharp increase, isn't it? I mean, we've talked before about how COVID and teams having to work from home, and perhaps that lack of security really ramped it up and made things become very difficult. But it's not tailed off, is it? It's still increasing and people are finding their ways in. Have you got more experience and examples that you've come across recently, perhaps more recently, of things going on that people might not be aware of? Just some of the examples.
Yeah, do you want me to start with that one?
Yeah, I think that would be, yeah, no, just
Yeah.
just real daily experience examples that people can look out for that they perhaps haven't thought of yet.
Yeah, and so one big thing is with external fraud and those fraudulent emails. Now, I like to call AP the bank of AP because that's what fraudsters think of AP as, right? They send in some details, get them changed, and all of a sudden they receive some payments, right? And one of the things that I have seen is that with the increase in all of the phishing emails that the FBI reported, they report every year on an IC3 report with all of the fraud complaints, and those fraud complaints increased over 50% from 2019 to 2021. And the result of all of those increased phishing emails, right, to get the login credentials is that they have the actual login credentials for your vendors and could be for your internal employees as well. And so sending that change my bank account request becomes a lot harder to detect if they are in your vendor's email. And not only that, they are smart enough to find a old email string in your vendor's email and then send the request from that to throw you off even more. So again, they are innovating, and I see that quite often. The other thing that I see quite often is that confirmation phone call that's supposed to solve all of the issues with fraudulent payments and is supposed to catch it is really not working. We've seen my past 2 clients over the summer, as well as a couple of press releases, most particularly the city of Portland, and it was another company too, I forget their name. However, they made those confirmation calls and still sent fraudulent payments. So the fraudsters are innovating, but we've actually put the humanness in some of our internal controls to offset it. And I think that has really increased external fraud.
Okay, Sarah, what's your experience when you talk to clients? What's happening more frequently now?
Yeah, I think just a lot of organizations, because there's so many changes, I'm talking about expense policy as well, of people working from home, they're not updating their policies too. So there's changes that have happened in the world that now have us working from home or working in other places, but their policies are reflective of pre-pandemic times. So trying to cross-reference what's now allowed or within policy, it needs to be updated as well. So just, continuing, making sure that's a flexible document that you're working on.
So basically, they're not working as fast as the fraudsters are to keep on top of things, it sounds like to me. Okay, well, let's turn and pick our way through some of the research that's been done in this global study, which was sponsored by SAP Concur and carried out by IFOL. So just the top thing, 44% of teams that were questioned knew somebody affected by AP fraud in the past 3 years. Now, is that a surprise to you two? Let's start with Sarah, or would you expect it to be higher, or is that really what you're finding? I mean, that's almost half of AP teams know something that's gone on somewhere.
Yeah, I unfortunately not, but I think that's the nature of what I'm speaking with businesses and clients about. You know, just again, the constant evolution of things, new employees that are now responsible for an AP process that haven't been trained appropriately or don't have the knowledge or information. It's as simple as having invoices tucked in a drawer that you miss, and things like that you know, maybe seem harmless, but that can add to you know, a compromised problem.
And is this a problem across all sizes of business? I mean, I don't know whether you deal with very small firms, but I mean, medium size, large size, doesn't matter. It's affecting them all, I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah. We work with organizations as small as having, you know, 10 expense reports coming through up to large scale organizations with thousands of expense reports. And it's the same types of problems, simply at scale as the organizations get bigger.
Okay, so I've got quite a few statistics here, but I think if we look behind them and talk about them, they're quite interesting. Deborah, 44% of responders said it would take them a few days to identify a fraud. 19% said it would take a few months, and 6% said they wouldn't know about fraud till year end. I mean, that's surely unsustainable for a business, especially if it's a clever fraud.
Yeah, I think that's definitely unsustainable. And the number of days, 44%, I would expect that to be a little higher, especially if you don't have processes in place that can find it, right? So 44% is good. I would have expected that to be a little lower, though, closer to the months, because particularly if you're talking about payment fraud, lots of times the accounts payable team, they don't find out until the vendor tells them, right? And that can be months after, that can, you know, when they're doing their statement reconciliations or when they miss a payment. So I'm a little surprised that, you know, that high would find it in days, but it's good. It's just not what I would have expected, because so often I see that they're not notified or are not aware of it until the vendor notifies them.
So you're not really surprised that 6% don't find out till year end. What are they not
No.
looking at? What exactly is going on there? Give us a kind of a scenario about how you could avoid it till then.
Yeah, so a couple of things that I recommend that you do is one, do daily bank statement reconciliations, right? Lots of times you have demand deposits or direct deposit. Well, I'm saying it wrong, but the vendors are submitting their payment or their invoices and deducting the payment directly from the account. You don't know that until you go in there and do your bank reconciliation. And so if you do that on a daily basis, you can catch them and you can reject those disbursements. And so that's one. And then the other thing is that if you have any payments that have gone out the door, particularly if they are higher payments, right? If they're more significant than your average payment, and that can vary by business, contact the vendor and make sure they received it. And then that way, if the vendor has not received it, right? So you send the pay file one day, it gets to your bank, accepts it, it gets to the vendor's bank the next day. The day after that, the vendor should have it in their account. And so within 2 to 3 days, you should be able to contact the vendor and verify they received it. That way, if they didn't receive it and you sent it to a fraudulent account, now you have time to recover it. And then the last thing is just do vendor statement reconciliations on a consistent basis so that you can catch them versus waiting for the vendor to catch them when they do it on their side.
Sarah, do you have anything to add to that kind of experience where people don't pick things up until the year end?
Yeah, I completely agree with Deborah. More checks and balances to verify those expenses. Deborah talked to the AP side. From the expense side of things, you know, utilizing credit card data, making sure that you have your credit cards being matched with each expense, so you know that there's no gaps. Digital receipts for things such as mileage reimbursement. That's an easy one for inflation. Things like that. really help stop.
Okay, well, the top three measures that the people identified for themselves, the AP departments that were questioned, were digital payments, secure and regularly updated vendor master files, and fraud training for AP members as standard. Now, what's your experience? So digital payments, what are the benefits there? Sarah?
Yeah, I would say digital payments are just being able to reconcile every dollar. So cash is harder to reconcile within a system. We're seeing simply credit card programs, etc., virtual cards, ghost cards. They're just easily aligned to an expense report line by line. So very simple to see what's outstanding and what's mismatched.
And are we moving? I know it's different in different places. I know it's different in the US, Canada, and the UK, but we are moving away from cash, but perhaps more slowly in some areas than others. What's your experience of that?
Yeah, I still see a lot of organizations that do out-of-pocket expenses, reimbursements for employees, and I think some organizations or technologies that are out there, such as Concur, allow for personal credit cards to also be linked to the system. So regardless, it's not cash, it's not going to pull in your entire statement, but you can pull in specific line items from your credit card. So even if it is personal spend, it's still not being categorized as cash. So it's easier to reconcile still.
Okay, Deborah, I remember talking to you a few months ago and you saying that, there's still quite a lot of cash being used in quite big organizations in the US. Has that moved on? Are people gradually moving away from cash a little bit more?
So I think so. My big experience has really been on the checks, right? Because the U.S. has always been kind of behind other countries in the issuance of checks, and with the events over the past 3 years, U.S. companies have really had a push to convert those check payment vendors, but they are converting them, right? The push is converting from check payment to ACH payment. And I would have much rather seen that push or conversion be from check payment method to card payment where possible, right? Because you have more fraud protection on cards. And in addition to that, suppliers, especially because of what, the happenings of the last 3 years, are more apt now, right? They are more amenable to accept any charges that may come, any fees that may come with that. So for the fraud protection, I would have rather have seen that conversion go from check payments to card payment versus ACH payments.
So if anybody's out there who hasn't had a big push yet and are thinking about moving from checks, that would be your advice right now.
Yes, grab the vendors or suppliers that will accept them, and then everyone else then look at ACH, but try them with the card first.
Okay, so number 2, secure and regularly updated vendor master file. Now, Deborah, you have a lot of experience in this area. Why does it not happen? How often, and what should people be doing to make sure that they really are doing a good job on that master file?
Yeah, so the biggest thing, I love that you asked about securing, because you do need to make sure that you are following least privilege access strategy or methodology. And that really means that you only give access to those team members that actually have to have access. Even, if you are posting invoices, you don't need to have access to the full tax ID, to the full bank account number. The last 4 or 5 digits should suffice. Only give access to those that absolutely have to add and edit the vendor master file. And then that really limits the ability to social engineer someone and get that information because they just don't have access to it. And what I've seen over the past 3 years is that team members were given access because of the abrupt change to work from home or work from another environment. And they were the only ones that could, get up and running quickly enough, or as a result of this great resignation, right? other employees may have to cover. And so they get this access, but then when the need is no longer there, they still have the access. So make sure you're doing those security role and security access audits. And I would even say do those on a monthly basis. And then with the vendor master file, that just definitely needs to be kept clean to make sure that the vendor data is still valid. But even before you put that information into your vendor master file, make sure it's validated. And if you have, if you're doing ACH payments, collecting bank account information, if you can, try to validate that bank account ownership to make sure that it belongs to your vendor.
Because presumably, to go back to what you started talking about, if you have a smaller group of people who can access something, if you do get in the unfortunate position of having to investigate something, it's easier to get to the bottom of it. So it works a bit better all the way around.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Sarah, let's come to you. You a bit later on will be talking about, you know, how technology can help with some of these issues, but it sounds to me still, even if you go for the technology, you need good housekeeping. You need to know exactly what's going on, and you can be helped with that. But this regularly updating things, checking things, removing people that shouldn't have access to things, that's never going to go away, is it? However much technology you use.
Absolutely. And a lot of our audit tools and processes are supplemented with specially trained auditors. So the actual human component is still necessary. As good as the AI checks and balances happen, then it's those exceptions that are flagged. Who's checking those? So you still need that human component at the end. If we can direct those humans to the right area to make sure they're spending their time on the areas of concern, I mean, that's ultimately what we're looking to do and support organizations with.
Well, interesting you should say that, because number 3 in what people felt should happen was fraud training for AP members as standard. Now, what are we talking about here? How much effort, how much time, and how many people in the team? Everybody? Sarah, what would you say?
I'm very interested to hear Deborah's take on this too, because I know we talk about audit training and talking to your AP finance team just about what their responsibilities are, but in specific on fraud training, I'm interested to hear, what Deborah has to say about that training component.
Deborah.
Yeah, so I love that the answer to this survey question was 87%. Well, actually, I shouldn't say love, but 87% responded yes. They do think that their team could benefit from training on finance fraud, because what I think, my view is that anyone in accounts payable or expense, they need more than the standard cybersecurity awareness training, right? You need to be kept up to date on frauds, because these fraudsters are always evolving, and you need to be kept up to date. And so what I suggest is that on a daily basis, right, you have that stand-up meeting with the new scams that are out there. Find places that you can get those alerts. The IRS has alerts, the FBI has alerts, the Better Business Bureau has alerts. I have alerts. And so if someone was, registered to get those alerts, they would have found out in May of 2019 that the fraudsters are able to remove that external indicator on email that your IT team put there, so that you can get all the warm and fuzzies, right, that you didn't get one. And so, yes, that email is from your internal employee because it doesn't have an external email indicator. Well, the fraudsters know how to remove that. And so that would have been something that would have been great to share with the team that day, or even just put on your agenda for your next meeting. Have it be a static agenda item, and then make sure that you are sharing these experiences of fraudulent email. Don't forward the email, just take a screenshot of it and make sure all the team members know about it. So yes, I totally agree that they need to have additional training. It's more than cybersecurity awareness training. You need to be updated on frauds.
Do you need a specialist on the team, a fraud specialist who that's their remit, that's what they're looking at all the time? Is that helpful, cost effective?
So I think that would be great if you kind of combine it with what Sarah was talking about, right? Auditors. So auditors, because I think the auditing piece is great from all sides, expenses, and then also your vendor process audit as well, to make sure that the internal controls and best practices, authentication techniques that you're putting in place to avoid fraud, to make sure that they are always being done the same way that you would audit like the expense reports or the accounts payable process. So I think that that fraud specialist slash auditor type role that kind of knows what to look for and can identify fraud when they see it as they're doing the audit would be great.
Okay, so one of the things that was thrown up by the research was that AI and machine learning clearly can spot things that people can't, however good they are. So Sarah, would you like to illuminate us on that particular area? What kind of things are we talking about? You know, if you've got a really well-trained person, what can't they spot?
Sure. I mean, for organizations that operate internationally, having an AI system that can read different languages. You're seeing receipts from different places. You don't necessarily know if they are what they are claiming to be in the expense line item. So just having simple, review in your own language, and then identifying if this is actually a type of expense that has been attached to this receipt. For example, doing a food delivery service, but the receipt item is actually for alcohol. Well, if that's not, it's in the realm of food and beverage, but if that's not something that's within your policy, is that going to be flagged, or is that simply going to be approved because it's still within food and beverage and maybe no one knows what that particular store sells? Right. So having the audit AI checks to say, hey, this company actually just supports the sale of alcohol, things like that, giving insight and visibility to your auditors is extremely helpful.
Okay, so let's look at the types of fraud now, because I want to ask you both, are some much easier to spot than others? Are people kind of almost more aware of some than others? So it said internal fraud, top 57% expense fraud, and kickbacks and embezzlement 56%. So that's pretty easy. And for a naive person like me, that sounds as though that's what you would expect. Is that the kind of fraud that people kind of look out for typically? Deborah.
Yeah, and I would say yes, and that falls right in line with what the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners have found. They are one of the largest anti-fraud organizations that provide education, and they also do an annual report. And in their 2022 report to the nations, they indicated, or they show the results of a 10-year study from 2012 to 2022. And what they found is that it increased, or there was an increase in the collusion between employees. So 10 years ago, it was one employee that was, perpetrating the fraud most often. And now what they find is that more employees are colluding in order to perpetrate that internal fraud. So the fact that, the internal fraud that you mentioned earlier that is related to kickbacks and that type of thing have increased is not surprising at all, and is right in line with what the ACFE found in their report, their 10-year trend report as well.
And the sad thing is, in human terms, as life gets tougher, and I think it is in lots of places, that is going to maybe not increase but not get any better, is it? So it needs to be looked out for a company's health.
Yeah, and I would say too, the ACFE talks about the fraud triangle, with internal fraud, opportunity, rationalization, and pressure. And I think that has all three of those have really been heightened with the events over the last 3 years.
Yeah. External fraud, as we spoke about earlier, duplicated invoices, which again would be easily picked up with some machine learning perhaps, or what have you. Billing schemes and false companies, 36%, cyber attack and email spoofs, 36%, and then right at the bottom, check washing and mail fraud. So cyber attack, about a third of what people are coming across, and I guess that's what technology can help with too.
Absolutely, yeah. Any fraudulent, I mean, even duplicates, etc. Simply putting a through match process in your AP process is very helpful, and then having a system that can match your POs to your PRs, your receivables, just having that multiple verification, making sure that you're actually paying the right invoice at the end of the day is definitely lessened by having automation or technology in place.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm sorry. And I was just going to add there, I think it's more important now than ever to have that technology, especially around the identifying duplicates, because as a result, and Sarah, I'm sure you saw this too, right? You had more vendors at the beginning, right, of the pandemic, and really continuing now, sending those multiple invoices over and over again because of delayed payments. And that really hasn't, it continues to happen. And so the result of that is more duplicate invoices. And if you don't find them, then it's more duplicate payments, right? So I think it's more important than ever to have that technology in place to find those duplicate payments, and then other issues related to invoices.
Just before we move on to some of the steps people can take and a bit more about the technology that works, how do accounts payable finance execs feel about the fraud risk in your experience? Are they pretty complacent? They think they've got it covered? Are they really worried about it? More worried, less worried than they should be? Deborah, your clients, when you come across them.
Yeah, so I think they should be more worried than they are. I still see so many that think that, the confirmation call is all that's required, or they assume that their team members will catch them all, right, because they're all so catchable. But that's just not true anymore. I talked before about the fraudsters getting into your vendor's actual email and sending a change request from an old email string, but they're also doing things like monitoring our social media accounts, finding out what posts we like, who we are connected to. So when they send that email, they know what context to put it in. They know, to use certain terms that we use to make it seem more legitimate. And so I don't think that from what I'm seeing, that the leadership understands that all of this is happening until something does happen.
And then it's too late. Sarah, your view?
Yeah, and Deborah talked about the external. I would say the same for internal. It's very hard for leadership to think that the staff and their employees that they have hired would do anything, untoward that would be against the business. So it's hard to have them, establish an auditing process that's going to target a specific group, or at least give an overview of 100%, and then narrow it down to the fraudulent groups or individuals that you're seeing to make sure you're targeting. It's a hard conversation for a lot of leaders to kind of agree that maybe there are some issues, bad apples, or just unintentional fraud that's going on.
Okay, so sorry, Deborah, you wanted to join in there.
I just wanted to say too that I recently saw an article posted. So we all hear about the quiet quitting, right? Where employees are doing just the bare minimum to get by. But there's an opposite to that, and that is they are actually quitting, but they are perpetrating fraud on their way out. And I think leaders need to be aware of that as well, right? So they've got two different extremes that need to be dealt with. But one, right, will actually cause them that internal fraud, that loss.
Yeah. So let's move on to the tips you can take to reduce fraud risk, and maybe start with the point that if you make it really, really difficult to defraud the company, both internally and externally, then you have to have fewer of those awkward conversations that you were talking about, Sarah. So talk us through some of the things you would suggest to people, Sarah, to use technology, for example.
Sure. I'd say looking at it in kind of two ways. One is first establishing the right technology before the spend happens. So implementing a pre-approval process, as simple as that sounds. At Concur, we have a tool called Request, and it's simply for gaining authorization on spend before it happens. On the invoice side, ensure you have, purchase request is what we call it, but it's POs that you're issuing beforehand and getting approval on. And supporting your employees on making really good decisions on behalf of the organization to combat that unintentional fraud. So make it really simple and easy for them to see what is within policy, not having to go and cross-reference with a document, but having a system in place that's color-coded. For example, show all the flight options that they can choose that are within policy. They're highlighted in green. It's very simple to see, what is within policy versus maybe what is yellow, what is red. We use a simple stoplight system to help employees make good decisions and understand quickly, because ultimately we see a lot of organizations, they see employees making better decisions on giving them just better, easy access to select. And then after the fact, after the spend, is the compliance and choosing the right type of audit for your organization, reviewing receipts against expenses, comparing them to your policy, but then utilizing AI technology, as we talked about. So submitting expense reports that are going to go through receipt translation, which I mentioned, errors in policy compliance, and then having a specially trained auditor to review those exceptions, because as your business grows and scales, reviewing every single expense line item that's coming in is just not going to be possible, but making sure they're spending time on the right ones and looking at any flagged errors.
So a pair of technological eyes, some other eyes to pick out the really important things you should be looking at, and letting the things that probably are perfectly okay and assessed as okay to leave them alone. Deborah, what would you say people need?
Yeah, and I love what Sarah said, especially the pre-approval and the auditing afterwards, because what the ACFE has indicated is the biggest driver, or as the biggest driver of internal fraud, is really just a lack of internal controls and that overview. And so I think those are great suggestions for, or I wouldn't even say suggestions, those are really requirements, right, to avoid that internal fraud. And then on the external fraud side, I think you need to put some processes in place, some techniques in place, right? Because AP is always so very happy to help you, right? We need to act like the bank that we really are. When you contact your bank, they will identify you, right, by asking you 2 to 3 key identifiers before they even discuss whatever you contacted them to talk about. And so you need to do the same thing with your vendors to make sure that you're actually talking or communicating with your vendor and not a fraudster. And then also put in additional internal controls, authentication techniques, and best practices to avoid external fraud. And then have that audit piece, just as Sarah said, right on the expense side, have that on the vendor process side to make sure that the team members continue to do those things you put into place.
And Deborah, in your experience, how big a change is that in the culture of AP departments? I mean, is that a huge change that's coming up now that some departments do and some don't? What was your experience?
So I think it's a huge change that, but it's a needed change. And I will say, yes, it is going to take more time because it is more manual steps, right? Authenticating is more steps. Doing more validations is more steps. Auditing is more steps. But I think it's absolutely necessary. And you don't want to get into the position where you only realize that after a fraudulent payment has occurred.
Okay, so Sarah, with those extra important steps that you want everybody to follow, how can technology help? You've mentioned a little bit how it can reduce some of the other stuff, so you've got more time to think about the steps that are needed. But in terms of change, so how does that happen? And also in terms of change, do people need to go back to the drawing board? Because sometimes that's what stops people adopting new technologies, isn't it? They think I've got to wholesale change everything. I can't get all my staff through that training. We cannot do that. What would you say to that kind of worry?
Yeah, there definitely is a change management component to putting technology in place or changing any process. What we always talk to our clients about at the beginning is to review and revamp the policy before putting any technology in place. Let's make sure that we are auditing the right things, that we are highlighting the way that we want our employees to spend the company money ultimately when you're reimbursing expenses in the right way. So going through that process, I think from an AP side of things, the staff usually love it because there's less, head to head going back to each employee and saying, I found this, and it's, hey, the system flagged this. This is the policy. It's been cross-referenced and here's what's been identified. So I know that's a positive. And I think from the employee side of things, again, sometimes they're submitting multiple expenses because they don't remember if they submitted it before. So it's, they're hoping that something's going to catch it and will assume that the system, whatever it is, manual or automated, is going to send it back. We see very often, if we were to both go out for lunch, I submitted the expense, you submitted the expense. We weren't sure who was going to, we didn't talk about who was going to submit it. So now you have two in there, and it wasn't, again, something to defraud the company, but something that the system is going to have to check because the employees are just going to, submit what they have if they are hoping that a system will catch it at the end of the day and tell them whether it's within or without or outside of policy.
Okay, Deborah, where would you advise people to start to overhaul perhaps an AP department that they feel is not quite as secure as it should be?
Yeah, so I would start with desktop procedures, and if you have them, look at revising them. If you don't have them, just start and create them. And as you are revising them, add in those authentication techniques, internal controls, and best practices. And then when you have a documented or a set of desktop procedures that document your process, turn that into a vendor policy, right? So that your internal team members know how to do business with AP, have your leadership sign off on it. And so now you've got a roadmap for how your team members need to set up vendors with all the internal controls, best practices, and authentication techniques included. Your leadership has signed off on the vendor policy, and with both, now you have a process that is auditable.
Thanks very much. Well, that's just about it. Before we go, Sarah, Deborah, any final thoughts, or have you covered everything you wanted to?
So I think I've covered everything I wanted to, but I want to just point back at that 87% from the survey indicated that they could use additional training. Find that training and get it for your team. Thanks
very much. Sarah?
Absolutely. I would say back to those two methods of accounts payable fraud that you sourced, or your research report you sourced at the beginning: duplicate invoices and expense fraud. Making sure that you have the automation in place or the technology in place to support you with those two biggest areas of fraud that organizations are seeing.
Well, thanks very much indeed. Thanks, Deborah Richardson and Sarah Hurst from SAP Concur. Thanks you for joining us. You can find more information on membership of IFOL and courses on the website. And this webinar will be available on demand on the IFOL website from tomorrow. So please share it with colleagues. We'll send a link to today's session, a guide to the points that have been made. Thanks again for joining us. Goodbye.
Okay, thank you.